Well, we want to turn our attention here now to another long-running conflict, and that is in Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which just several days ago passed the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of that conflict. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Brian Becker, who's the host of the Socialist Program, which you, of course, can watch here on Breakthrough News, 7 o'clock Wednesday. That's Eastern time, 7 o'clock every single week on video. And they also have a couple great podcasts you can check out every single week as well. Brian, thanks so much for being back with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here to discuss what has to be one of the most manipulated issues, at least in the U.S. and European media, and that's Ukraine. We're 2 years in. Maybe I'm just whistling in the wind here, but I mean, it seems that we're in sort of a bizarre situation where I can't possibly see how Ukraine can win. They seem to have almost already lost, but nonetheless, there's still this big discussion being driven by the U.S. and the U.S. administration in Europe to double down, to provide more money and more weapons. Where do we stand 2 years in?
Well, interestingly, just a few hours ago, the head of state of Russia, Vladimir Putin, spoke to the Russian people, to the Russian nation, in a annual televised address. It's kind of their State of the Union address. And he took up the issue of Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, suggesting, as he did in the last few days, that NATO countries should be ready to send troops to Ukraine to rescue the failing war effort that the Ukrainian armed forces have been waging for the last 2 years, with death and destruction on both sides, numbering in the hundreds of thousands in terms of the casualties, dead and wounded. So Macron is like, no, let's send NATO troops to fight in Ukraine. So Putin addressed this, Rania and Eugene. He addressed it just a few hours ago, and he said, we are telling them, including the president of France and the NATO countries, that we have nuclear weapons, and these weapons reach targets in your country. If you decide to do as others in history have done, and he's obviously referring to both Hitler and Napoleon, which is to bring military forces towards Russian territory. And let's remember that Russia now considers the Donbass, the eastern areas of Ukraine, or formerly part of Ukraine, and the southern part of Ukraine called Crimea, to now be officially part of Russia. So Putin is saying to them, if you go forward with this madness, you have the responsibility to tell your people that we have nuclear weapons and we will, as we have in the past, defend Russia with all of our might. So Putin is raising the stakes. This is a big raising of the stakes by the Russian government. He said, you must understand, meaning a message to Macron and, of course, to Biden and Blinken and Sullivan, the ones who really drove this war. You must remember that the existence of civilization is now at threat, is now at risk, is now at risk of being destroyed. This is in the last few hours. Here you have the U.S. government fighting a proxy war against the Palestinian people, because that's what the Gaza genocide is. You know, Israel couldn't go on one more day and if Biden put his foot down. It's a proxy war. The U.S. wants Israel to destroy Hamas and win the battle, win the war in Gaza, and they want to do the same thing in Ukraine. So they're using other people to fight American imperialism's war, and on both fronts, they're not going to succeed. They're not going to succeed in Ukraine because Russia's a strong country. It has 5,000 or 6,000 operational nuclear weapons. And they're not going to succeed against the Palestinian people, who have no army, no air force, and no navy, but who have this spirit of resistance, as Leanne, your earlier guest, talked about, a spirit of resistance that will not be extinguished. And here we are, let's just think Korean War, Vietnam War, Afghanistan War, Iraq War, Libya War, Syria War. I mean, war after war after war. The U.S. is not winning these wars, but it's constantly waging these wars and letting the rest of the world know that they're ready to do anything. They started in 1945, dropping nuclear bombs on civilian cities in Japan, proving to the world that they have a weapon that no one else possessed. And unlike the rest of the world, they were willing to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians in an instant. So all of this manifests military power to show we're the boss. And I think on all fronts, the only thing that they're succeeding at is creating oceans of human misery, but not tactical or strategic, and certainly not military success.
Brian, I do wonder, does it matter who becomes president, whether this war continues or ends, or this Cold War, should I say, continues or ends? So like even putting Ukraine aside, because there's a lot of conversation and all we can do is speculate, but like, there's this from one end on the Trump side of things, there's people who will argue that Trump's going to end the war in Ukraine because actually they oppose that war, which I don't think is actually true, but I'd love to hear your take on that. And then there's another way of looking at this, since you brought up Gaza, or the argument I hear is that, but Trump would be so much worse on Gaza. And all I can think is, well, what's worse than genocide? So I'm just curious if you could address those issues, because that's the conversation I keep seeing on the internet.
Well, at least what I'm getting from your question, I'm not suggesting it's a loaded question, but what I'm getting
not at all, Brian. I don't know why anybody would think that.
I'm getting from your question that you think those things are BS, very bad sociology. And I would agree with that, because Trump won't end the war in Ukraine unless America is completely defeated. Let's not forget, Trump did that which Obama refused to do in terms of escalation on Ukraine. Trump sent the Javelin missiles to Ukraine, and Obama, before he left office, said, don't send Javelin missiles to Ukraine. That will escalate the struggle. That will create the contradiction such that an out-and-out military conflict might happen. So Trump went far beyond Obama. So this idea from the Republican right wing that they're anti-war, and some idiots on the left who somehow sort of reflect this as if there's some hope within the MAGA world that there's going to be a less militarized imperialist foreign policy, that's nonsense. And Trump, when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to the Palestinians, one of his first acts was to declare that Jerusalem, in violation of international law, would become the capital of Israel. That's a violation of international law. I mean, that is a clear sort of gift to Netanyahu. Netanyahu was his poodle all that time. But is there anything worse than what Joe Biden is doing? The answer to that, too, is no. Because as you're suggesting, Rania, there is nothing more heinous than genocide. It's the ultimate war crime, the ultimate criminal act, the extinguishing of a people in whole or in part. Those 12,500 Palestinian kids, or as I think one of you mentioned, almost 25. Oh, you quoted Rania, Lloyd Austin saying at first that 25,000 women and children have been killed in your last segment, and then they tried to walk it back. Those kids and their moms who were killed, they weren't killed because they did something to Israel. They were killed because they're Palestinians. So the definition of genocide, the destruction of a people in whole or in part, is manifestly obvious by the U.S. conduct and the U.S.-Israeli conduct in Gaza. They're killing children and their mothers because of who they are, because they are Palestinians living in Gaza. So you can't be worse than Joe Biden, but Trump will be equally bad. Like, there is no hope within the two capitalist parties. There is no hope. I mean, there's actually no hope within the U.S. electoral system because it's rigged so that really progressive candidates like Claudia de la Cruz, there are others who are running, Jill Stein, Cornel West, they are going to run important campaigns, but they're excluded from the debates. They can't get on TV. We're running as a protest, as a demonstration in the electoral arena against the system that's so, sort of addicted to militarism and war. But this system in the electoral system is rigged so only those two ruling class parties get to win. So if you think like maybe this ruling class party will help me, or this ruling class party will help me, then you're not understanding the problem. The problem isn't this politician or that politician. I thought that when I was 15 and protesting against the war in Vietnam, I thought, oh, if only we could have another president, this war would end, this genocide against Vietnam would end. It's not the politicians, it's the system, and the politicians are simply the operators of the system. They're there, they should be condemned, but they're not going to change anything. We need, in fact, a new system. But how do you get to a new system? It doesn't come all at once. You can't snap your fingers. This is a process of revolutionary and radicalization of a population through mass movements, through mobilizations, through teach-ins, through breakthrough news, through all kinds of platforms that are, bring enlightenment to the people about what the nature of this system is. This system is addicted to war because, one, war is good business for the capitalists, and two, war is the method by which U.S. imperialism, the corporate Wall Street elite, maintain their domination over the rest of the world. It's a rich man's war. We pay for it, but it's their war. And we have to bring consciousness about why, in fact, we need a new system.
No, I think those are important points. Glad you brought up the issue of Donald Trump, who in the recent New York Times article about the CIA's role in the war in Ukraine said that when he became president, only strengthened collaboration between the CIA and Ukrainian intelligence. But, it leads to my other point, which I think is picking up what you were saying there in the end. I mean, it seems like, Brian, so much of what is out there, the mainstream media, the politicians, is also trying to hide the true nature of the war. I mean, you have so much in the Macron piece that you referenced at the very beginning. Oh, there's no boots on the ground. Oh, we're not involved. But then every time you turn around, it's like the CIA is running the whole thing, and they have a string of bases that are over there. You have these mercenaries that are there. There are special forces that, it's unclear exactly what they're doing, but seem to be moving in and out of Ukraine, helping various different aspects of this, but that they are desperately afraid that people will actually get a sense of how deep the involvement is of these U.S. military, European militaries, because if people feel, hey, we might be getting embroiled in another potential nuclear war with boots on the ground where our friends, neighbors, and loved ones may die, that then the support for the war may wane. So I wonder what you think about that, especially, building off that New York Times expose of the CIA basically controlling the whole issue.
Yeah, it's a U.S. war. I mean, Ukraine is now a colony. It's essentially a colony. You might call it an independent sovereign country. It's not. It's been colonized by the United States. It was formerly a part of the Soviet Union. I mean, Kiev was formerly the capital of Russia for 300 years. They've taken over all of the former parts of the Soviet Union, not all of them, but many parts of them, in the former socialist government allies of Russia in the Eastern and Central Europe. They said, we're gonna fight against communism because we're gonna have freedom. No, it's not freedom. It's colonization under another name. Bringing countries in Eastern and Central Europe into NATO is colonization. And the U.S. government has not only taken over their intelligence services through the CIA, which we now know, Eugene, based on this reporting, it's also the economy is being taken over by U.S. Wall Street banks and hedge funds and equity firms. All of Ukraine, including the public property, which was socialist property from 1922 until 1991, socialist property for the benefit of the people, that's all being ripped away from their country and taken over by Wall Street. And finally, if the U.S. government, the real reason Biden isn't sending troops to Ukraine isn't really that much about Russia, even though that's a factor, because Russia now is making it clear it won't tolerate it. The American people would not tolerate it. Both of you know, I think, and I certainly feel it, that if Biden said this war in Ukraine is so urgent, we must fight for the honor, the dignity, the self-determination, the sovereignty of countries, not just in Ukraine, but all over Europe. And so we're going to send American young men and women to fight against the Russians in Ukraine. There would be millions of people. Some of them vote Democrat, some of them vote Republican, a lot of them vote independent, a lot of them don't vote at all. They would be in the streets in the United States because there is actually no tolerance by the American people for another war like this. They would rebel against it. So they're using colonized countries like Ukraine as complete proxies. I feel so terrible for the Ukrainian people. Their children are becoming ground up in this war. And the main complaint of the Pentagon officials, when you read between the lines, is that Ukrainians are becoming, quote, casualty averse, meaning they don't want their kids to keep dying in this endless war. But people all over the world are casualty averse. They don't want war. And that goes for the American people, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is, a very good summary of where we are 2 years in, and more in front of us, and of course, warmongering, but we will continue to cover it, as will the Socialist Program. And Brian Becker, you are the host of the Socialist Program, whose video version you can see here on Breakthrough News, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Wednesday. Thanks so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks.